Hey guys, it's Justine here from I Should Read That, and today I am bringing you my best books of 2020. Despite everything else that happened in 2020, it was a really great reading year for me, and I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that I was just stuck at home in lockdown, and I didn't really have anything better to do than read. So I read 128 books in 2020, and for the most part, they were absolutely fabulous. I enjoyed so much of what I read last year, which is great, but that does make narrowing down a best books list really, really difficult. So what I usually tend to do is I pick like every single book that I just absolutely adored in the year and I talk about all of them, but because there were so many great books this year, ironically I decided I'm going to chop the list down. So I chose my top 10 of 2020 and I have been agonizing over this list literally for weeks. I have had so much trouble with this, and there's so many amazing books that didn't get included on this list. So I think what I may do is on Twitter, you can go ahead and follow me. All of my social media stuff is down below. But on Twitter, I think I am going to do a thread of other amazing books so I can give some of these other authors some credit because I read some fabulous stuff this year. But this is my top 10 books of the year, with one little honorable mention, and I'll explain why there's an honorable mention in here later. But I picked my top 10. These are going to be in no particular order, with the exception of my top 3. Every year I pick a top 3, and that was also a really, really difficult decision. So for the first 7, it's going to be in no particular order, but when we get to the top 3, we are really going to be narrowing in on my absolute favorite reads of 2020 and why I loved them so much. So let's get started. Okay, so that honorable mention that I brought up before, the reason that I have been sort of pondering what to do about this book is I read it in 2020, I loved it, it doesn't come out until 2021 however, and it didn't seem fair to have it on this list when no one can like pick it up and read it right away. And I felt like it would be more comfortable to have it on my best books of 2021 list, but there's a good chance I'm not going to reread it in 2021 because I don't tend to reread books. So I've been agonizing over this, and actually Judith from Dead Good Book Reviews had the exact same issue with the exact same books. I basically just stole her idea. So thank you, Judith, for helping me solve this like brain-twisting agony. My honorable mention for my best books of 2020 is The Galaxy and the Ground Within by Becky Chambers. This is the 4th and final installment in her Wayfarer series, which is very, very sad. However, it is an absolutely fabulous way to send off the series. I fell in love with Becky Chambers' writing way back when the first book came out. I remember I had never heard of it before. I had never heard of her before, and I really liked the cover when I was wandering around a bookshop in London, so I picked it up on a whim, and it basically changed my reading life. It changed what I want from sci-fi. It made me much more aware of LGBTQ friendly books, and I just absolutely fell in love with it. I love it. I love her. I think that her books are just amazing. So this series has a really, really special place in my heart, and I was fortunate enough to read this book early before its publication in February, so you'll be able to get your hands on it next month. And if you're a fan of Becky Chambers, you are just gonna absolutely love this. The Galaxy and the Ground Within takes place basically on a really dull and lifeless planet. However, it has become very, very important in the galaxy because it's sort of at a natural sort of intersection of a bunch of different wormholes, which is of course the way that people tend to travel long distances across the galaxy. So people can come in and wait for their scheduled stop at one of the many rest stops on this planet. They can refuel, they can get snacks, they can, you know, stop for the night, whatever they need to do. So we follow one of these sort of rest stop businesses. It's basically like a bed and breakfast called the 5 Hop One Stop. And the 5 Hop is run by a woman named Ulu and her child. And that day they are looking at their schedule. They see that there are 3 ships that are coming in. So these ships land and everything is fine until disaster strikes, communications go down, and everyone is grounded. So all of the people on these ships are kind of, they got their own thing going on, they got their own lives, they have people waiting for them, and they are all stuck. And basically, like any good Becky Chambers book, they have to sort of learn to get along with each other, learn more about each other and about each other's cultural practices, even if some of the things that they thought and assumed about each other are kind of weird. And everyone just learns to get along. And it's just wonderful. It's lovely and gorgeous. And again, if you like Becky Chambers, you will love this. It's like pure Becky Chambers. And I just totally fell in love with this book. I fell in love with all of the characters. They're all absolutely fabulous. So like the other books in the Wayfarer series, this is definitely a companion novel. You don't really need to read these in any particular order. However, I would recommend reading them in publication order because that makes sense to my brain. But I do think that in this particular book, it's really helpful to at least have read The Long Way to a Small Angry Planet, which is the very first book in the series, because one of the characters that we follow, who is on one of the ships that lands at the Five Hop, is a woman named Pei. And we know Pei because she is the lover of Ashby, who is the captain of the Wayfarer, the ship. So we get to know her a little bit better, which was great. We also have a Quellen named Rovag, and he is just absolutely incredible. And we have a character named Speaker, and Speaker is a really, really interesting kind of piece in this sort of collection of people, because Speaker's people are very, very misunderstood in the galaxy, and you learn a little bit about the background in this book. This is such a fabulous and wonderful book. The thing that I love about Becky Chambers is, although the world is not perfect, things are obviously not so great. The government kind of sucks in the galaxy, and there's definitely lots of prejudices and kind of xenophobia, but our characters all are learning to be better people through their interactions with each other, and this kind of book gives me so much hope. So this is the perfect thing to read in 2021, and that's the reason that it is on this list. Okay, so now I'm going to start with the actual top 10 of the year. The very first book that I have is one that I've been meaning to read for ages, and I remember very clearly pre-pandemic, I was stood in a bookshop with Judith from Dead Good Book Reviews, our friend Asha, and our friend Josie, and we were all like just looking at the shelves, and Josie asked me if I had ever read this. I said no, but I'd had it on my shelf for years. It's one of those books that I knew I would love, but I've been putting it off for that reason. And she was like, Justine, you just need to pick these up. There's no reason to be putting them off. And I very much agreed. This is the 5th season by N.K. Jemisin. The hype is real for this book. This is one of the most beloved and kind of well-respected fantasy books in one of the best and well-respected fantasy series that is out there right now. And I knew I would like it. As I said, I've been waiting to read it for kind of a rainy day. I didn't realize how much I would love it. It's a hard book. It is a dark book, and some parts of it are quite difficult, but it's like nothing else I've ever read in fantasy. This is the first book in the Broken Earth trilogy, and the reason that it is called that is because in this particular world there are these things called seasons, and seasons are basically these catastrophic world-ending events. There are huge earthquakes, there are volcanoes, the sort of creatures, the animal life around them changes and becomes like these horrible predators, and it's this just absolutely devastating event, and all of civilization basically prepares for seasons to happen. So the season is beginning, and we follow a woman who is not only an Origin, which is a person who basically has an earth magic, who can manipulate the earth, start earthquakes, set off volcanoes, all these kind of incredible things, and they're very much feared and they're very much controlled and used in this world. So she's sort of in hiding, no one knows what she is, but in the very beginning of the book she stumbles upon the body of her young son who has been beaten to death by his father. This book is very, very dark. Just as a heads up if that wasn't clear before. And so she is basically going to flee and try to find her daughter, who has been taken by her husband and her daughter's father. And it's basically a journey of this woman trying to find her family, but also trying to survive basically in the apocalypse. It is fabulous. It is so good. It is, again, unlike any kind of fantasy book that I have ever read, and there is very much a reason that this is so incredibly popular. I would highly, highly recommend this, but again, it is quite dark, so if there's some of those themes that you're not sure you can kind of deal with, maybe go into it with caution. The next book that I have is a 2020 release. This came out in the spring of last year. I knew I would like it. I don't think I was quite prepared for how much I loved it, and also how eerily similar some of the themes are for things that we are going through today. This is Goldilocks by Laura Lamb. This book takes place in a not-so-distant future in which women's rights are beginning to be restricted, and we follow a team of NASA astronauts and scientists who are all women who are meant to be going on this mission to colonize a planet called Cavendish. However, they were kicked off of the mission because they're women. All of them were going to be replaced by men, and they basically steal the spaceship and they go and kind of claim their right to colonize this planet. So we follow Naomi, who is the ship's botanist, and she is also the sort of adopted surrogate daughter of this woman named Valerie, who's kind of an Elon Musk type character. She's a very wealthy woman. She's at the head of all this innovation, and she's the one whose company built the spaceship. She's also going on this mission. So they're in space, they're heading toward Cavendish, and they realize that things may not be quite as rosy as they thought, both on Earth and on the ship itself. This is a really interesting book because it was definitely marketed as a sci-fi thriller, and I do think it has a lot of those elements. Don't get me wrong, some crazy stuff happens in this book, but what I really loved about it and what I really appreciated about it is that it is also a very quiet book, because we follow this character Naomi, and she is not like the, you know, space opera hero going around kicking butt and shooting blasters. She's a botanist, but she is also a very smart woman, and when she realizes that things are not quite going according to plan, she has to take action. And that was something I really appreciated about this book. There's also the fact that some of this is a bit too real, hits a little too close to home. Some of the politics from the US president and the party that's in charge, some of the sort of attempted restrictions of women's rights and what jobs women can hold, and a lot of it just felt a little bit too close for comfort, but it was also really well done. So if this sounds like your kind of thing, I would definitely recommend it. Think kind of sort of Handmaid's Tale in space, and you'll have a vague idea of what this book is like. I absolutely loved it. Next, I have Kingdom of Copper by S.A. Chakraborty. I actually read this book and the finale in this series, which is Empire of Gold, in 2020, and I had some trouble deciding which of the two books was going to go on this list because they're both fabulous. The whole series is fabulous. I would highly recommend the entire David Budd trilogy. But I think that this is my favorite in the series, and I don't feel like I can really go into why, but a lot of the development that happens, especially with certain characters and relationships between characters, is really fabulous, and this just totally knocked my socks off. This book follows a young woman named Nari who is living on the streets of 18th century Cairo, and she's basically a con artist. She's an orphan, she doesn't have anyone who can support her but herself, and so she cons the kind of foreigners who are coming in to invade Egypt and the people who are living there, and she also has this kind of affinity towards healing magic. She can sense sicknesses, and she can help heal people. So one of the cons that she runs is this particular ritual, which I believe is kind of almost like an exorcism type ritual, and turns out that what she does is actually real. She summons a djinn, and everything kind of goes wild from there. She ends up being brought to Daevabad, which is the city of the djinn, and she gets entangled in the politics there. It is so good. It is so good. This is one of my absolute favorite series of all time, and this is probably my favorite book because what the author does, even just from like, I think it's like page 29, my jaw had dropped. And it basically stayed that way the entire time. This series is absolutely worthwhile if you are interested in strong and clever women, really, really interesting interpersonal relationships, particularly between families, politics, backstabbing, incredible world building, and culture. It's just like, it's so good. The magic is wonderful. The characters are amazing. Everything about this book is so good. Everything about the series is wonderful. And I cried my eyes out at the end of Empire of Gold. So technically, I would say both of those books are on this list, but really like Kingdom of Copper was just so good. Then we have two novellas on this list, the very first one being The Empress of Salt and Fortune by Nai Vo. I read this in December and I knew I would like it. It's another one where I knew I would like it, but it totally blew me away. So this is a, it almost feels like, almost like a set of fables wrapped around one particular woman's life. So we have a cleric who is traveling to this place, I believe called the Scarlet Lake, and this cleric runs into a elderly woman named Rabbit, and it turns out that Rabbit was the handmaid to the Empress, and she tells this cleric sort of various bits and pieces of her life in the palace and with this Empress, and the cleric kind of puts all of these bits together. It's a beautifully woven tale. I don't know if this is inspired by maybe Eastern storytelling or if it just felt incredibly fresh and original to me, but I loved the storytelling style. I thought it was really clever and really, really well done. I loved the kind of lush world building in this, and I loved how you could kind of almost like see and feel everything that Rabbit was describing. But what I think this book does really well is subtext. If you can kind of read between the lines, you will get a lot of what is going on behind the scenes, and everything that is kind of alluded to in this book, if the author decided to include everything and have everything kind of out there on the page for you, this would have been a full-length novel. Just the way that she manages to weave this all together and sort of like drops little hints in teeny tiny words and phrases is just so incredibly good. I would so highly recommend this. You can pick up this book now as well as the sequel, which is When the Tiger Came Down the Mountain, which I have not read yet, but I'm planning to read soon, and I'm fully expecting to absolutely adore both books in this duology. The second novella that is on this list is Upright Women Wanted by Sarah Gailey. I was a little bit unsure about picking this one up because I like Sarah Gailey's writing style, but the only other thing I read by them was Magic for Liars, which I thought was just okay. It had a lot of potential, but it didn't quite hit the mark for me. However, I loved this. I loved it so much. I listened to the audiobook and I would highly, highly recommend that because the narrator is fabulous, and it's one of those stories that really, I think, suits narration really, really well just because of the style that it's written in. This novella follows a character named Esther, and Esther has hidden herself away on a librarian's cart. She is escaping a arranged marriage that her father has put together for her to the man that her best friend was engaged to. And the reason that she is no longer engaged to that man is that her best friend was executed for having possession of propaganda material. So Esther runs off, and she is mourning the death of her best friend and lover when she is discovered by the librarians in the back of their cart, and basically she ends up joining up with them. This is basically a kind of like an alternate American Southwest. It's very much a Western, which usually doesn't quite suit my taste, but I thought it was really, really, really well done. The world building is so fully realized, the cast of characters is fabulous, and it is a super, super, super LGBTQ friendly novella, as you would expect from someone like Sarah Gailey. There are lesbian couples. There is Esther, who was having a relationship with another woman prior to this book starting, and we also have a non-binary love interest, and the romance is really, really fabulous and really well done. I thought that this was so incredibly good. I say this all the time whenever I read a novella that I really, really love. I'm always so incredibly impressed with authors who manage to fit this amount of world building and character arcs and, you know, plot and fun into such a short word count. I thought that this was such an incredibly good book. I will rave about it forever because I don't know many people who have read it, and I would so highly recommend it. Next, we have a collection of short stories that I will not shut up about because I absolutely love these. This book basically has changed my thoughts and feelings on short stories and on short story collections because they were not something that I necessarily enjoyed as much before. However, this totally blew me away. So this is Exhalation by Ted Chiang. So this book contains 9 works ranging from short stories, very short stories in some cases, to full novellas, and one of those novellas is his Hugo nominated, I can't remember if it won or not, novella Anxiety is the Dizziness of Freedom, and it's so good. This whole collection is incredible. There are some that I liked more than others, but just as a whole, this is an incredible collection, and it will absolutely resonate with anyone who enjoys science fiction, people who want maybe a little bit more of a literary science fiction experience, but really any sci-fi reader will enjoy this, I think, and anyone who doesn't necessarily read sci-fi but wants to sort of pick up something a little bit different. I think that these are both very literary and very accessible at the same time. So there are a couple that I particularly enjoyed from this collection. The Life Cycle of Software Objects is a novella, and that will really get to anyone who ever had a Neopet like me, and I thought that Omphalos, which is a story, it's kind of like an alternate Earth where religion and science have kind of swapped places. It's really fascinating. I think that was also nominated for a Hugo for novelette. Basically, it's an incredible collection of short stories and novellas, and I just cannot recommend this more highly. Based on this book, and just this book, I am planning on picking up a lot more anthologies, whether they are single author or multiple authors, because I want to recreate the experience of reading this again because it was just fabulous. So the very last book, before we get into my top 3 for my best books of 2020, is one that I kind of picked up sort of on a whim. And I'm really glad that I did because I'd never read this author's books before. I had no context for her writing whatsoever. This is Black Sun by Rebecca Roanhorse. I have Trail of Lightning, which is, I believe, her debut, somewhere behind me. I haven't picked it up yet, and I plan to, definitely, but it is, I believe, more of an urban fantasy, and this is much more of like an epic fantasy, and this definitely falls more within my wheelhouse, so that's the reason that I picked this up before her first book. And I loved this. It was so good. It's, when you read a lot of fantasy, I say this all the time, when you read a lot of fantasy, especially like one particular subgenre of fantasy, like epic fantasy, as I do, sometimes things can get a little bit samey. You see a lot of the same tropes over and over, you see a lot of kind of similar settings over and over, you see a lot of the same characters over and over. So when you get something that feels really unique and different, for me that is such a special reading experience, and that is what I got from Black Sun. I was kind of in, not a full reading slump, but I was in sort of second lockdown, everything sucked. I didn't really want to read much mode, and this pulled me right out of it. It was wonderful. So this book is sort of centered on a sort of cataclysmic event that is going to be happening, and the start of every chapter is almost like a countdown to that event. We know when it's going to happen. It's going to be on the day of the solar eclipse, when the power of the sun is at its sort of least powerful, and we have all these characters who are converging upon a particular city. So that city, because I always get it wrong, is called Tova, and in Tova there are some very serious sort of class divides and divides between the various clans that inhabit the city. So everything kind of centers on the Crow clan in this particular book. They are the victims of a massacre several generations ago, and they've never really recovered their power. They're kind of the lowest of the sort of high class sort of subsection of society. So a lot of this book centers on a character named Serapio, and he is the son of a member of the Crow clan, but he's never been to Tova before. However, he is now making his way there to do this kind of incredible thing that will trigger this cataclysmic event. He has been ritualistically scarred and blinded in the way that is traditional for his people, at least the scarring, not the blinding, and he is basically going to be the vessel for the Crow god who will come down and elevate his people and get revenge on the people who have wronged them. So a lot of the other characters sort of swirl around Serapio. So we have a character who is a ship's captain who's she's so cool. She's basically kind of like a quasi-humanoid mermaid type character, and she's foul-mouthed and amazing, and I absolutely loved her. If you like capable women, she is fabulous. We have the Sun Priest, who is kind of in a position of being an enemy of the Crow clan because a previous Sun Priest had ordered this particular massacre against them, but this woman wants to kind of equalize the city, and that gets people really, really upset because she wants to change the status quo. We have so much going on in this book, and it's one of those where you can really, the tension sort of rises and rises as people kind of converge and get closer and closer and closer until we reach the end. This does have quite a cliffhanger ending. I cannot wait for the second book. It can't come quickly enough. And I am fully sold on Rebecca Roanhorse's writing. I think she's a fabulous, fabulous author, and I can't wait to dive into others of her books because this was so incredibly good. Okay, the time has come. We have my top 3 books of 2020. These are all really good. Really, they could kind of be interchangeable in these top 3 slots, but as I've said a million times, I've agonized over every aspect of this video. And I thought really, really hard about my sort of placement of these books. So, my number 3 book of 2020 is The Bone Shard Daughter by Andrea Stewart. This is her debut novel. And the fact that it is a debut, I think, is really, really fascinating because it's just like, it's just mind-blowing. It is so wonderfully sort of fresh feeling. Again, when you read a lot of fantasy, sometimes things get a little samey. This felt so unique in a lot of different ways, and it has fabulous characters, really, really, really cool magic system, and I thought that it was just incredible. So this is a very much a favorite of the year, and I cannot wait to get my hands on the second book because it's going to be so good and I'm desperate to know what happens next. So The Bone Shard Daughter follows multiple perspectives, but the main one I'd say is we follow a character named Lee, and she is the daughter of the Emperor. You would assume that that would make her the heir, however the Emperor has not named her heir until she recovers her memories from a childhood illness. This makes her weak. She can't remember anything that happened to her before the age of, say, 16 or so, and she has kind of a rival, sort of almost like an adopted son slash mentee type character to the Emperor, and he is really excelling. He's learning this bone shard magic that the Emperor has mastered and is the way that he can sort of control his empire. Then we have a couple of other characters. We have a governor's daughter who is in a relationship with a young woman who is lived in poverty and grew up in poverty, so they're from 2 very, very different social classes, and the tensions between the two and how one can never really understand the other despite how much they may love each other. We also have my absolute favorite character ever. We have this guy who is a smuggler. He's very much a reluctant hero, which is like one of my favorite tropes ever. He's a smuggler, and he ends up sort of caught up in this sort of attempt to steal children away from these ceremonies that remove a shard of bone from behind their ear and their skull. Every citizen in the Empire has to do this because it fuels the Emperor's bone magic. We'll talk about that in a second. But basically, he ends up kind of getting caught up in being a very reluctant good guy and helping spirit these children away. He witnesses a kind of cataclysmic event, and this ends up sort of changing his perspectives on life. He also has an animal companion who is the best thing in the entire world, and I love with all of my heart named Mephi. You can discover Mephi on your own because he's so good. And I love the way that all of these storylines ended up kind of weaving together and how everyone became relevant to each other, even though maybe they don't necessarily meet or they don't meet for a long time. It was just so good. It was so well executed, and you can tell this is a labor of love from the author. It is fabulous. If you like adult fantasy, I highly recommend this, but also if you read a lot of YA, I think that this has some of that crossover appeal, but it would definitely be a further step into adult fantasy than some other crossover books. It is so good, and I so highly recommend this. My number 2 book of 2020 is a book that I think will actually have a lot of crossover appeal in the other direction. I think that adults will really, really love this YA book for a whole host of reasons that we will talk about in a minute. This is actually the only YA book on my list, which is surprising because I read a lot of really good YA last year. But something about this felt really, really special. So this is Raybearer by Jordan Ifueko. This was her debut, I think. And it's a really, really fabulous book. So basically we follow in this book a character who is very isolated. She grows up sort of shut up alone in a castle, sort of being taught by people who are afraid of her and who are afraid of her mother, who's this kind of figure called the Lady. And the Lady is very intimidating, she's very scary, she's also very, very absent. So she grows up very much alone, and she learns that she is basically being trained to be sent to the capital to almost like audition to be a member of the prince's sort of council of 11 sort of friends who make decisions for the empire, and who will eventually be elevated when the king dies. They will be elevated to like the king's council, and they are the closest friends to the prince. They are connected by this incredible magic called the Ray, and she is basically going to become one of these people, and then she's going to kill the prince because only members of his council are able to actually kill him. She doesn't want to do this. She really doesn't want to do this. But the Lady ends up compelling her with a magical wish, so she has to. So she gets to the capital. She ends up obviously becoming a member of the council. And it's very much a found family book. This is the only real family she's ever had. It's the only real connection to other people that she's ever had, and she knows that one day she is going to have to kill her best friend. It's so good. I thought that the world building in particular is fabulous. It is so good. It is so well fleshed out. It is very lush and rich, and especially things, even like the architecture of the building and everything that the characters wear is so wonderfully visual, and you really, really get a picture of what this world is like in your mind. I also really loved all of our characters. Tarisai, who is the main character, the girl who's going to kill the prince, she's fascinating because she's very much a young woman. This book takes place over many years, but she's still quite young throughout the book. But she makes these really well-informed decisions. Sometimes her decisions are kind of dumb, but you get where she's coming from. You understand her every step of the way. And in that way, she feels incredibly mature, but at the same time, she still feels like a teenager when she's meant to be a teenager, or a child when she's meant to be a child. And I think that that is something that will really appeal to adult readers, because sometimes I think you can get caught up in the fact that these books are about teenagers, and teenagers don't always make the best decisions, but they're teenagers. This, I think, will really, really appeal, but it is still a sort of really good interpretation of a teenage character. The side characters are absolutely amazing. Her friends on the council are fabulous, and I really loved the magic in this book. This magic of the Ray that only the royal we have Dax, only the royal family has, that connects these special people together. They can communicate almost like telepathically, and there's this thing called council sickness, where if you are away from any member of the council for a long period of time, you will eventually sicken and die. So it really ramps up that found family aspect, and I know that that is something that a lot of people, including myself, really enjoy in books. So I thought that this was just fabulous. I would highly recommend this. I would also highly recommend the audiobook. I switched back and forth while I was reading this, and I read kind of a little bit from both, and the audiobook narrator is so good, and there are some kind of like not necessarily like full songs, but kind of like sing-songy bits in this, and she does a really good job with that. So I would definitely recommend the audiobook format, but you're still gonna get so much out of this book if you read it in a physical format. Okay, the time has come for my #1 book of 2020, and I don't think this will be a surprise to anyone who has seen my Best Books of 2019 video, because the first book in the series actually tied for #1 for my favorite book of last year. So my best book of 2020 is The Call of the Bone Ships by R.J. Barker. There's something about this series that seems to have like targeted every single thing that I love and enjoy in fantasy books and wrapped them up into one package. It's amazing just like how many beats this series hits for me in particular, and it's so good. I really think that this series is something very, very special, and I really hope that more people end up reading it because it's just so incredibly good. The Bone Ships is set in a sort of seafaring culture in the 100 Isles, where, as I'm sure you can possibly imagine, there is not a lot of land. There are these very small islands. So if you are a seafaring sort of nation that doesn't have a lot of land, you don't have a lot of wood, what are you going to build your ships out of? You're going to build them out of the massive bones of ancient sea dragons, which is awesome. So at the beginning of the first book, the sea dragons have basically been hunted to extinction, and this really, really impacts so much of life in the 100 Isles, from how people get around and sort of government can control things, to how they conduct war against the Gaunt Islands, which is the next nation over, who also have bone ships. So we follow a character named Joran Twinner. And at the beginning of the first book, he is a very kind of pathetic man. Through no fault of his own, he is the captain of a black ship. And a black ship is basically a ship of the dead. In this culture, if you commit a crime and you are sentenced to a death sentence, you are sent to serve your sentence on a black ship, and you basically serve the 100 Isles until you die. You are never gonna get off one of these ship crews. You're gonna live your life at sea, and you're gonna die this way. So Joran has been sentenced. We don't know to what particular crime, but he has been elected captain, and he's basically drunk under a tree, sort of wasting his life away, when he gets kicked awake and his sort of captain's hat is stolen by this character named Lucky Mias. And Mias is this sort of legendary figure in the 100 Isles. She is the daughter of basically sort of the queen-like figure, and she's this almost mythical figure. She cannot be killed. She's amazing. Her ships are always incredibly well run. They get out of all kinds of disasters. She's Lucky Mias. So she ends up taking over the captaincy of this ship, and Joran is demoted, and they end up sort of getting entangled in the hunt for the very last sea dragon that has ever been spotted. So it's the first dragon that's been spotted in generations, and it could turn the tide of the war, but Lucky Mias wants the war to end, so she is setting out to protect this dragon. And the second book kind of continues where the first book left off, and we get into a lot more stuff and things. So in the second book, we get a lot more into various aspects of the culture that we don't see on the black ship, because the first one's very focused on this one particular ship, and sort of life on the ship and the people who are on this ship. And it gets into a little bit more of the government and how different islands are run, and sort of things like that. I don't want to say too much, but the thing that I think is really special about this series is not only do we have amazing characters like Mias, who is an older woman, and she is in this kind of position of power. She has this great relationship with Joran, who you would imagine would be really, really angry and try to like take his position back, but he's like, you know what, she's better suited for this than I am. And he ends up growing so much as a character, and they have this wonderful platonic relationship, which is something that RJ does really, really, really well. He does this in his Wounded Kingdom series, which I would highly recommend as well. And the sort of seafaring culture is so inherently optimistic. You have this, you would think it would be this horrible, horrible way to live when I sort of describe how hard life is. There's this whole thing around disability, which may be a little bit uncomfortable for some people, but you are considered lesser if you have any kind of physical disability, and a lot of the people on these bone ships do have this. So you'd think it would be this horrible, horrible way to live, and this really hard life. And it is a hard life, but these books are all about people doing better for themselves and becoming better. And there's something about them that is so wonderfully optimistic and really almost heartwarming. And I think that the sort of the way that life on this ship is conducted is, it's almost, again, it's almost like a found family type book, but everyone is really gruff, which I love. I also think he has this incredible talent for creating atmosphere, especially, I love any book that is set at sea, on sea, around the sea, by the sea, anything like that. And he is, so far from what I've read, the absolute master of writing seafaring books because of the way that he describes sort of the feel of the salt spray on your face, how life on the ship works. It's so visceral, you can really imagine it in your head, and I think he's just such an incredibly talented writer. So enough of me, like, rambling about how much I love this book. I would so highly recommend this series. The last book comes out next year. I'm not ready. It's gonna break my heart, but it's so good. I absolutely love these. So those are my 10 favorite books of 2020, including one little honorable mention. I had such an incredibly good reading year in 2020, and the fact that I did have a good reading year, I think really, really helped me pull through in a time when everything else was very, very difficult. So I would love to hear in the comments below what your favorite books of 2020 were. If you read any of these books, I'd love to hear what you thought, or if you've got them in your TBR. I post bookish content to this channel fairly frequently, so go ahead and hit subscribe, check back soon, and I will see you next time.